Good morning. This is Cindy Welch, the Assistant Director here at Swiftland. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Understand the Differences Between Digitization, Preservation, and Curation with Krystal Thomas. Krystal Thomas is the Digital Archivist at Florida State University Libraries under Special Collections and Archives. Her work is a mix of digital project creation, management, supervision of the Digital Library Center, and acting as a consultant for digital archiving projects on campus and in the community. Krystal received her MSI from the University of Michigan in 2009 and has been with FSU Special Collections and Archives for 7 years. Please help me welcome Krystal Thomas. Krystal, over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. Good morning, everyone. As they said, my name is Krystal Thomas. I am based up at Florida State University, where I do a lot of work with digitization projects and digital preservation. So what are we going to talk about today? Let me figure out how to change the slides. Here we go. All right. I wanted to start with a little bit of levity, and The Princess Bride is always a good place to start. Archivists love using this particular quote for any number of words that people like to appropriate from our work. But this one seemed particularly apropos for our discussion today because I do feel like throughout cultural heritage organizations, we're using these words: digitization, preservation, curation. We're using them interchangeably in many ways, but they are not all the same, even though they are definitely all connected. So, spoiler alert, we're just gonna start with breaking down all of the things. Digitization and preservation are steps in a bigger digital curation workflow. And as we'll see during this webinar, digitization is often the starting place, which leads to a need for digital preservation over time. And then as you build up your digitization and preservation programs, you'll eventually just kind of mature into a full-on digital curation workflow at your organization. So what we're going to do in the webinar today is we're going to define each of these processes separately. We're going to discuss the activities that go into each of them and the tools that you would use to be successful in the process, and how they build on each other to get you to that final stage of a full digital life cycle that you are maintaining. As we'll discuss, you may decide that where you're at in the digital life cycle is good for you and you don't need to move on right now, which is a completely valid answer and okay. So let's get started. We're going to start with digitization. Digitization is the process by which you create a digital surrogate of a physical object in your collections. This work is usually undertaken so that you can provide better access to the item through an online platform of some kind. Digitization itself is not digital preservation. It may be a part of your physical and digital preservation planning, but straight digitization, especially digitization undertaken only with access in mind, is not digital preservation. Now, you may choose to digitize an item due to lots of different reasons, but one certainly could be that it's physical condition or there are physical preservation concerns around the item. That is a completely valid reason to digitize something, but that is not what we would consider digital preservation. And also, it should not be the entirety of the physical preservation, because hopefully you aren't simply discarding the object after you've digitized it. I do talk quite a bit about this sort of work in a prior Swiftland webinar that I gave on selection criteria for digital collections. So I would recommend checking that out if you have more questions, particularly around selection of materials and why you might digitize something. Staying with that idea of selection, that is certainly part of any digitization project that you might undertake. You most likely are not digitizing the entirety of your holdings. You might be over time, but probably not all at once. So you would be doing curation as part of a digital project, but that isn't what digital curation is, which can be confusing because we're using the same word to mean two different things, which we also like to do in the archives. So what are the activities of digitization? These are probably the most common actions that are usually spoken about in cultural heritage organizations when we're using those three words. We say digitization, preservation, curation. What we probably are talking about in many ways are the activities of digitization. You plan a digitization project, and that's where that selection process often occurs. You do the work of scanning or imaging those materials. You describe those materials following an agreed upon metadata standard. And metadata for digitization is description of the original object that has been digitized to allow for its findability in its delivery system. You would then store the digital object and metadata potentially only until you load them into the delivery system, and then you may discard them depending on what your planning is long term for digital items. As part of this work, you should use, and you may even contribute back knowledge to digitization and description standards, such as the federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative, which is also known as FADGI, which you may have heard of, and then metadata standards such as Dublin Core would be recommended in this case as well. You will also need to manage the object files that you create, probably on a local server, until you upload them into a delivery system. And then there is the maintenance of those materials in that delivery system over time. The tools of digitization may vary quite widely depending on what it is you are digitizing, and then also the resources that you have to digitize with. So this photo collage is showing some of the digitization equipment we use here in FSU's Digital Library Center. These include overhead cameras, book scanners, handheld camera devices, flatbed scanners, various computer systems with specialized imaging software, as well as local and cloud-based servers for digital storage needs. You will also need some sort of delivery system with which to provide access to your digitized content. You may build something in-house. You may choose to use an open source software that you house in-house, like Omeka, or we use Islandora here at FSU. You may also choose to pay for a hosted option so that someone else is running the software and storing the materials for you. A hosted option includes Omeka S or Content DM. All of these systems will require that a certain metadata schema be used to describe your materials. So in the cases of Omeka, whether it's a Omeka instance you're running yourself or one that you are paying to use, Dublin Core is the schema that is used and built directly into the system in a way to make sure you're following the rules of the schema, but also to make your lives a little easier as well. Digitization, especially the tools of digitization, are certainly not a one-size-fits-all, and you'll hear me say that a lot in this webinar. So it's really important to have a clear plan for digitization so that you know what tools you need in order to be successful in building up a digitization program in your organization. So before we move on to preservation, I wanted to ask if there were any questions specifically regarding digitization. All right, I'm not seeing any typing, and you'll be able to ask questions at the end as well. I did want to say that I've done several webinars for Swiftland, as well as other people, I believe, even here at FSU, on digital project planning and selection and lots of other digitization-based things. So if you want to know more about this particular stage of work, I'd recommend kind of poking around in the Swiftland website to see what other webinars are available. So we're going to switch gears over to digital preservation now. Digital preservation is an active, ongoing process with which to manage all your digital objects and ensure their continued accessibility over time. With digital preservation, we switch to this idea of a digital object. The digital object is both the content file and the metadata that you've created to describe that file. So we use digital object as a shorthand for both of those things. You may undertake digital preservation activities to safeguard digitized and/or born digital materials in your collections. Digital preservation has lots of different levels that you might be working on, and we'll discuss a way to think about those in a moment. So, digital preservation can be a bit like choose your own adventure in order to meet the needs of the materials you have on hand and for your organization. As digital preservation is a set of tasks and processes you would perform on your digital objects over an extended period of time, this is not a one-time type project like digitization projects often are. And while I said, as I mentioned earlier, digitization may be part of a larger digital preservation plan, digitization in and of itself is not digital preservation. And also, as mentioned earlier, digital preservation is a part of digital curation. So it will be part of a digital lifecycle that you're building at your organization. It's not digital preservation in its entirety. So as mentioned, digital preservation is a set of tasks performed over the lifetime of a digital object to ensure its continued authenticity and accessibility to users. Many shops that are actively working on digital preservation use the OAIS model, which is pictured here. OAIS stands for Open Archival Information System. So this is where we get that terminology of SIPs, APEs, and DIPs that you may have heard if you've done any reading or research about digital preservation. And what this model does is provides a common set of concepts and definitions. So what is a SIP, what is an APE, what is a DIP? And that helps groups and others facilitate creating specifications that archives need in digital preservation systems. So this model is tool agnostic and system agnostic. It's not talking about a single piece of software that you can use to do this work. It's talking about the concepts of the work that can help you build the tools to actually do it over time. Activities in the work of digital preservation include storage and maintenance of digital objects over time, usually in a dark archive environment. And a dark archive is simply a storage environment that has limited accessibility. You would also be keeping a record of the tasks done to a digital object within its metadata. So this is different from the metadata that is created as part of digitization, which is describing the object itself. Preservation metadata is tracking the actions taken on an object over time in order for users to know what has been done to the object to make it accessible, and that helps maintain its integrity and authenticity. So an example of this is if you need to migrate the file to a new file format at any point during your custodianship of it in digital preservation, you would need to make a note of that in its metadata so that future users know you migrated this word perfect file to a PDF for continued accessibility. Other activities of digital preservation include verifying and maintaining the object authenticity. That's usually done through the use of checksums. And again, if and when needed, you would migrate content files to a new file format if it's in a risky file format that is going to provide barriers to accessibility in the future. You would also, as you do with digitization, be following and potentially contributing back to best practices and standards regarding digital preservation tasks and workflows. The National Digital Stewardship Alliance, or the NDSA, maintains a document called the Levels of Preservation. They put out a fairly new version of it, I believe last year. That's a really great document to start with if you are new to the work of digital preservation, because what they have done is outlined different levels of preservation and what are the basic actions and information you should have at each level within your digital preservation workflows. So I recommend looking at that if this is something you're looking to get into. The tools of digital preservation, like those of digitization, can vary widely and depend depending upon your organization's needs, available skill sets, and resources, you might need some, all, or none of them might exactly work for you. I've only listed a few here. I list lots of tools and resources in this webinar. It should not be considered exhaustive. If we were going to be exhaustive, we'd be here a very long time. But the few that I did want to list about digital preservation include a dark storage space with limited accessibility. Here at FSU, we use Amazon Glacier that only myself and I think 2 other systems people have access to. Providing limited accessibility means that those are our master preservation copies, and not touching them means we don't alter them in any way. Usually for this work, you will need a tool that will help you identify file formats that you may encounter. You will see lots of file formats that you've never heard of or seen in your life. I recommend Pronom. Pronom is a file format registry which is maintained in the United Kingdom. It also is a good place to look for free tools to do digital preservation work. So one example is a tool called Droid. It was developed by the UK National Archives to perform automated batch identification of file formats, which can be really helpful. Checksums are another great tool. These are sometimes referred to as hash marks or hashtags, not hashtags, that's Twitter. So checksums are alphanumeric values that uniquely represent the contents of the file. They are used to verify the integrity of the file. Essentially what they're doing is checking to see if any of the bits of the file have changed or become corrupted, and that would mean that the file is no longer the same one that you originally received. A tool such as AV Preserves Fixity can easily be used to generate and monitor checksums over time. If you are in a situation where you're having to deal with preservation of an entire external hard drive or other physical media that you need to preserve the entirety of, a disk imager program is really useful, as that captures a picture of the entirety of the item and not just the individual files. Also for that, FTK Imager is a free program that can do disk imaging for you. Also, usually, if you're doing that kind of work, you'll need a write blocker, which just is a, how to describe a write blocker? It's basically a tool to make sure that by you looking at what is on an external hard drive, you aren't changing it in any way. It creates a wall between you and the objects to make sure you can't inadvertently change something just by looking or opening files. Premise, which stands for Preservation Metadata Maintenance Activity, is the international standard for metadata that is used to support the preservation of digital objects long-term. It can be really helpful to look at Premise before you even start doing digital preservation to see sort of how it's going to fit into your current metadata practices. The cool thing about Premise is it can be used as an extension schema. So if you are already using Dublin Core or mods to capture your descriptive metadata, Premise can be used within those files as an extension schema so that you can record all the information about a digital object in a single XML file. It's also perfectly okay to keep a separate preservation XML from your description XML. But you can also combine them all into one, which can be helpful over time. BitCurator is a suite of open source tools that you can download and use to run different checks on your digital files. It does some of the same activities as some of the individual tools that I listed above. However, it also includes tools that do pre-imaging data triage, forensic disk imaging, which is also what FTK Imager does, file system analysis and reporting, identification of private and individually identifying information, and also can export technical and other metadata through different processes. So BitCurator gets a bit more at the digital forensic side of digital preservation. Often it's also quite focused on born digital materials rather than digitized materials. You can also, BitCurator is getting at this a bit, but you can also just have an entire system that manages all of your digital preservation workflows and can do all of the different tasks that each individual tools can do as well. So what we're planning to use here at FSU is Archivematica. We're still working out the logistics of what that's going to look like for us, so we don't have it up and running yet. Archivematica is an open source tool, and I always like to remind folks that open source is sort of free like a puppy. It is free to download, but there's going to be a lot of work in getting it up and running and maintaining it over time. So there are also, just like there is with digitization, paid hosted options that you might also look into for digital preservation if that would be a better fit for resources at your organization. So before we move on to digital curation, are there any questions about digital preservation? Okay, no typing, so we'll move on. I also did an entire webinar on Introduction to Digital Preservation last year for SwiftLim, so I would recommend checking that out if you want like a full-on intro to digital preservation. All right, so digital curation is sort of like the 30,000-foot view of all of the digital activities. JISC, which is an organization that's based in the United Kingdom, has defined digital curation as the work of maintaining and adding value to a trusted body of digital information for future and current use. In general, you're going to find that this particular term, digital curation, is used a lot more with electronic records and data than it is with cultural heritage materials. It is also a term that you hear more used in Europe than in the United States at the moment. In the US, we tend to just call this the digital life cycle instead of digital curation. So in this section, you're going to hear me reference a lot of United Kingdom organizations because they tend to be who's discussing digital curation. Because this is the bird's eye view of all the things, digitization and preservation are part of the digital life cycle that is represented through digital curation. So we're all doing parts of digital curation, but only organizations that are actively maintaining and managing their entire digital life cycle from creation all the way through preservation and delivery could be said to be doing straight up digital curation. And again, it's sort of something that organically evolves as you build your digitization and digital preservation programs. You sort of just by default start doing digital curation. And because digital curation encompasses all the things, many of these activities that we see here and that I didn't even list also appear under digitization and digital preservation. So with digital curation, as I mentioned, there is often a greater emphasis on born digital materials. So you see here first the care of the physical media, external hard drives, CDs, tapes. There's probably lots of other obsolete media we could list here that would be part of this work. Data is also a bigger part of the digital curation lifecycle, particularly the management of data. So how is data being created? In what formats is it being created? In what formats is it being stored? How are people describing data as they're creating it? And how are people accessing it both as it's active data and also later once it's archived data? Digital archiving and forensics are probably kind of the closest matches to digitization and digital preservation listed here. Data recovery is also a major activity for digital curation. So the tasks of actually figuring out how to pull out and serve recovered files over time. And as our other two words, with digital curation, there is the need for standards and the management for wider information systems. The Digital Curation Center, or the DCC, is an internationally recognized center of expertise in digital curation with a focus on building capability and skills for research data management, and they are based in Scotland. And this group is who maintains the agreed upon standards and the most widely used model for digital curation, which is what we have here. So this DCC curation model was developed much along the same lines as the OAIS model was developed for. It shows a tool agnostic, digital lifecycle that institutions can use to develop their own processes and workflows around a digital lifecycle. And I think once you get a look at this, you really can see easily how digitization and digital preservation are parts of this big picture of what it means to do digital curation. And the easiest way to do that is kind of cut the circle in half horizontally, and the top part of it would really be the things we kind of talk about when we're talking about digitization. We're curating, we're selecting, we're transforming objects. We are doing it usually to provide access. And then the bottom half of the circle is the actions of digital preservation. We are ingesting it into a specific system. We're doing preservation actions as we need to. We're storing it. You'll note migrate is also part of, it starts in that bottom half of the circle. So does reappraisal, which I like that they included that here. That's a big part of born digital access and preservation over time. But you see how these two words of digitization and preservation basically equal curation at the end of the day with the life cycle. So what are the tools of digital curation? Now we've discussed Archivematica and BitCurator already as tools of digital preservation, and they fit here really well too. And any of the tools we discussed under digitization would fit here as well too. However, because digital curation has an even bigger focus on born digital materials, we can talk about some other tools that become useful at this point. Drambora is another tool that was developed by the DCC. It stands for Digital Repository Audit Method based on risk assessment. And what it is it's used to assess risk in your repository and also to help you figure out how to mitigate those risks, usually around file formats, whether your storage is meeting certain requirements. It's a good sort of audit for yourself to figure out what are the risks facing your repository and how do you start to deal with them. And along those same lines is TRAC, which stands for Trustworthy Repositories Audit and Certification. And TRAC is maintained and used by the Center for Research Libraries here in the United States. And the criteria and checklists that come with TRAC are used for auditing and certifying digital repositories as a trustworthy repository. But it's also a really good tool for self-auditing and for taking a look at what does TRAC see as important and what are we missing in our organization and how do we start to get those more in line with each other. Data Accessioner is a free tool that you can download. It's used for migrating content files between media and maintaining the integrity of the files while doing so. So if I recall correctly, and it's been a while since I used this one, it is creating and checking checksums as it moves material around for you from, say, an external hard drive to a server through your computer. Jove is a tool that's maintained by the Open Preservation Network. And it's an open source tool that is used for file format identification, validation, and characterization. Droid, I mentioned when I discussed Pronom earlier. That's used to check file format types in bulk. And then, I spelled emulator wrong. Apologies all. An emulator is a very cool and interesting tool that you might use. You might use it if you have a piece of software that you need to preserve and provide access to that requires a computing environment that no longer exists. So say you have a piece of software that you need to provide access to, but it's only going to run in a Windows 3.1 environment. You can build an emulator that will spin up that sort of environment, and then you can run your software through it. So it can be expensive. It takes a lot of technical know-how. If you want to get an idea of what we're talking about here, you can go to the Internet Archive Arcade. It's also a really great way to lose like hours of your life and play a game through Internet Archive. Play the original Oregon Trail or play the original Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. And what happens when you press play, is that the web browser and Internet Archive spin up an emulator of the original environment that game would have needed to run, and then you're playing the game in that environment. So it's a bunch of different emulators for the games to be played through, and it's really cool. And again, as I said, very takes hours of your life away. So you'll note overlap with a lot of these tools. It's really a matter of exploring and finding the one or the set of ones that you need for the type of work that you need to be doing. A suite of these tools working together to follow the digital curation lifecycle then constitutes what digital curation is as a process. So are there any questions about digital curation? You're all very quiet. Ooh, yay. Question from Chris. Clearly, this all requires a significant investment of intellectual and financial resources. Are there options available to outsource various parts of the whole? So there are and there aren't. It depends what parts you want to outsource. Really, what they've developed, particularly for digital preservation, is you buy an entire system if you want a hosted version for someone else to kind of be thinking about it for you. And that is a valid discussion to have. You know, once you figure out, okay, how do we do this in-house? It's going to take these 5 tools. I'm going to need to attend these 3 trainings. It's going to take up 20 hours of my week. At that point, you do all the math. It might actually make sense to just outsource the whole process or pay for a piece of software that's going to do the whole process for you. So that is that challenge of figuring out how much does it cost to do it in-house versus to pay someone for it. And it also, again, would depend on how much material you're actually talking about having to take through the entire process. You know, we have a digitization program. We're starting working through our digital preservation program here. Not everything that I put through digitization needs to go through the entirety of the digital preservation workflow. You know, we've created a digital preservation framework to help me make decisions about what requires the extra work versus what is sufficient in our digitalization delivery system platform. So it's a good question, and unfortunately there's no great answer. It's sort of something you kind of have to play around with and figure out. And Dean, what exactly is emulation? Emulation is tricky, and I full disclosure, I am not that techie. My understanding is an emulator is essentially a virtual machine that when you access the piece of software that you want to be able to use, and it requires a different computing system than what is currently available, the virtual machine spins up a computing environment that can run the software. That is my understanding. I would have to do a lot more research to give you a much more technical answer. Yes, you would be emulating a legacy operating system. So like Windows 3.1 is a good example. You might even need an MS-DOS environment for certain pieces of software. You can pretty much, as long as you can get your hands on the original code for whatever operating system it is you need, you can build an emulator for it. Any further questions before we move on? Okay. So I just threw lots of information at you all, but I don't want you to panic or feel too overwhelmed. So I wanted to sort of give you some takeaway actions or thoughts that take this back a bit more to the basics. So knowing where you are is half the battle of this. You need to be able to talk about what you've done, what you're currently doing, and what needs to be done in the future at your organization. So you might be at the very start of this. You might be just starting to figure out what does digitization look like. Or you might be like, we have lots of digitized material. We're starting to get more in digital collections. We need to start to think about what does preservation look for us. Just knowing where you're at is a really great place to start, because so many people are still confused about where they are. You may also figure out where you're at and decide you need to stay there at the moment, and that is perfectly okay. Being really good at digitization, just having the basics of digital preservation in place might be what is right for your organization right now. It might be because due to staff expertise and time, due to available money to get the tools and expertise that you need, due to priorities at your organization, that just might be where you need to stay at the moment. So knowing that and being able to articulate where you're at, and then also being able to say what it's going to take to get to the next steps, that's really good to be able to talk to your organization. Like if your supervisor comes around and says, okay, we're doing good, what else should we be doing? You should be able to say, well, you know what, we're getting lots of born digital collections in. I really think it's time that we start to think about what we're doing with that material long term. Like all things digital, there is sadly no one size fits all for this work. It really does take some experimentation. It takes some willingness to be able to say, you know what, we might be a little in over our heads here. What do we need to learn in order to be good stewards of this material that we have? And kind of the thing to keep in mind is what works for one organization just very rarely works for all the organizations. It might be too little for what your organization has on hand. It might be way more than your organization would ever need to create. And understanding and using that sort of digital life cycle model and figuring out sort of where in that model you best fit right now and sort of what your aspirations within that model are is a really good starting place from here. And always keep in mind, particularly with digital preservation, that doing something is better than doing nothing. So it's okay to feel overwhelmed, but you need to keep moving forward, because if you don't do anything, then you definitely will lose access to material at some point in the future. And so just doing something is always better than doing nothing. And then here I included a list of all of the standards, tools, and resources that I mentioned during this webinar, so that you can follow up if and when you're ready to. My caveat is that this list is by no means exhaustive in any way, shape, or form, and that also, like all technologies, some of these may be gone tomorrow. However, I did my best efforts to really only talk about resources that are stable. They've been around for a long time. They've been adopted by large parts of the digital community. So they should be quite reliable and available to you as you move forward into this work. Oh, my gift didn't play. That's okay. But I wanted to end back with the Princess Bride and just hope that this was all good information for you, and to ask if there were any further questions. Oh, Georgian has a comment. My issue is the lack of support from IT. I don't have access to our servers, so I'm looking increasingly at remote hosting. Yeah, I talked a bit about dealing with IT in my introduction to digital preservation webinar. They can be the greatest allies in your organization, but they take a lot of education because they don't understand the work of the archives. They haven't really had a reason to, probably up until now. So it does take quite a bit of education and really fussing sometimes at your IT department to be like, I need this kind of support because of X, Y, and Z. And sometimes it also helps to go a bit above the IT department and get the leaders of the organization really on your side, because that will also help some movement. But again, you can also find ways around IT, as it sounds like you're looking at remote hosting. We here at FSU, I'm lucky that the libraries has our own IT department in-house. However, even the libraries have been looking more and more to distance ourselves from main campus IT due to costs. So we're actually almost entirely, I believe, an Amazon web server shop now in the libraries, or we're moving in that direction. It has a lot to do with cost, and also it does give us a lot more control over access to our servers and what we can and can't do. So yeah, that dealing with IT is certainly a challenge in all three of these stages. Are there any further questions or comments? Yeah, I just threw a lot of information at you all. I do apologize that that much had to come out all in one webinar. But yeah, just kind of sit with some of the information, do some reading. But I'm glad that you feel that you have a better idea of where to start now. That was my goal.
I agree with Michelle. That overview was great. This is Cindy here at Swiftland. And I'd like to thank Krystal for this really great webinar and let everybody know that there will be a recording because that is a lot of information and it's very in-depth. It's a topic I'm very interested in but know very little about, so I know I'm going to be reviewing the recording as soon as I get it edited and put back up on YouTube. And I'd also like to say thank you to Deb, our American Sign Language interpreter. She does a great job. And we're going to go ahead and shut our mics down. If you have any lingering questions, feel free to type those into chat. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cindy.